Well, I think that, yeah, I mean, it simplifies the issue to say that it's entirely a money issue.
Right.
Because the psychedelics are used by so small
Right.
a percentage of people that it doesn't rate the tremendous institutional fury that is brought against it, and where you really see the contradiction in economic logic is with pot. I think that the subtext of the government's fear about psychedelics is that this quality that they have of dissolving boundaries causes people to question basic assumptions about how society is run. And I think this is true of any society. It isn't an American phenomenon. It's that if you take psychedelics, whatever you are, Eskimo, Hasidic rabbi, quantum physicist, you will question your first premises. And you get millions of people questioning the first premises, and then the powers that be become very nervous. It's interesting that this whole phenomenon of the 1960s occurred because American commitment to universal public education brought its first generation of people to adulthood in the middle of the 1960s, because that universal commitment to public education began after World War II. After the establishment took a look at what this filling, actually funding and building up great public universities and then filling them with inquisitive young people, what the result of that was, that's when they decided to turn the universities back into trade schools for CPAs, which they did do. I mean, there is nothing like the level and the breadth of education and intellectual curiosity that was encouraged when I was going to school. That's all finished now. Now you're expected to do your data entry job, watch a lot of TV, and keep your mouth shut. And this is what we expect of our college graduates. So really, there was a crisis of faith in American institutions, which was only exacerbated by psychedelics. It was a combination of educating people to the actual traditions of Western civilization in large numbers for the first time, and then giving them psychedelics. Or having them exposed to psychedelics, and people began to ask questions for which there were no answers. And the response of the establishment was to suppress this. I mentioned cannabis. You're all probably aware through the work of the hemp people that cannabis holds many benefits, not necessarily related to its properties as an intoxicant, but as a source of food, lubricant, plastics, fuels, etc. The reason the establishment is so hysterical on the subject of cannabis is because it erodes loyalty to the industrial state. That's why, if you look at the pharmacological profile, let's contrast two familiar drugs. One, caffeine. We have the medical data which shows that it can contribute to fetal malformation. We know that it damages the liver. We know that it, if abused, can cause severe stomach ulcers, so forth and so on. Cannabis, vast amounts of money have been spent trying to find something wrong with it, and they're still digging, folks. They've decided it doesn't cause tits on statues. It doesn't, all the screwy things they've come up with over the years have had to be abandoned. Why is caffeine enshrined in every labor contract negotiated in the Western world as a sacred right of all workers twice daily? And why is cannabis you can lose your house, your automobile, your bank account, your art collection, simply because you had 6 plants in the back 40, and your children. Why this disparity? Well, what is the effect of caffeine? It makes it possible for you to perform your duties during the last 3 hours of the work cycle with efficiency equal to the first 3 hours of the work cycle. It allows people to tolerate spinning widgets onto Gombers until hell freezes over without a thought ever rising in their mind that maybe this is a ridiculous way to spend your life. Cannabis, on the other hand, people aren't so interested in going to work. They'd rather lay around and make love. They don't want to watch TV. They'd rather smoke a doobie and have a conversation with a friend. In other words, these things promote activities which don't make anybody any money and cause people to question the institutions and the social philosophies that are being shoved down their throats. If the playing field were level, caffeine might well be a prescription drug, not that I think that's a good idea, and cannabis, I think, would probably be freely available. The most dangerous drugs in society in terms of detrimental social impact are alcohol and tobacco, the 2 most freely available. I mean, every street corner of every city, they're peddled in vast amounts. We have a very crack-brained approach to the problem of drugs. We're not the only society. All societies seem to do this. Out of a possible spectrum of 20 or 30 depressants and intoxicants, most societies select 3 or 4 which they hail as harmless, and then the rest are, the seed of Satan. And this attitude is persevered in against all scientific data, against all medical research. This is just what people choose to think. The problem is we don't have the luxury of this kind of ignorance anymore. The amount of revenue that could be accrued from cannabis economy, the pressure that could be taken off petroleum extraction if cannabis were part of the picture. All of these things make it incumbent upon us, I think, to think more creatively and more honestly about which drugs really are posing problems for us. What was the first part?
The other question really relates to this is, why are there, given the fact, why is the percentage of shamans so small relative to a population? Because of the fact that, as you say, there's fear in going into, there's attraction and fear in going into these other realms. And there's obviously maybe some self-limiting aspect of the hyper-dimensional view, which there's some dynamic going on, because everyone has an equal opportunity to go to this hyperdimensional, but very few of their own initiative really push to that point where you are definitely within the hyperdimensional realm.
Well, there are different things to be said about this. I mean, first of all, there are what are called biochemical differences in individuality, and never more so than in the matter of drugs. People are very different from each other. Years ago, I took a course from Sasha Shulgin at Cal, and at one point he brought in some substance, I don't know what it was, and this was a class of 600 people, and passed it around and asked everybody to take a sniff of this bottle. Well, 598 people pronounced this stuff completely odorless. 2 people were almost violently ill from the overpowering odor of this thing. They possessed a gene for the sensitivity to this compound that caused it to be for them overwhelming, for everyone else unnoticeable. And we're surrounded by these kinds of individual biochemical differences. In traditional societies, shamanism is often a family business, and it may well be that this is because ability to handle these psychedelic substances and to really get mileage out of them is a genetic endowment of some sort. I mean, cannabis, again, it provides an interesting example. One of the commonest things you hear people say about cannabis who don't smoke it is they say, I used to, or I tried it, but it makes me paranoid. To the people who use it, this is inconceivable. In fact, it's almost an antidote to paranoia, because it seems to make things appear more Taoistic, more integrated. It all makes more sense. These are biochemical differences that need to be studied. You know, different racial groups have different relationships to intoxication. I mean, I think there's some truth to the idea that the North American Indians had a susceptibility to distilled alcohol that the Europeans, who had been dealing with it for a couple of centuries by the time they arrived here, didn't have, because the North American Indians represented a closed gene pool, never having been exposed to this. There was no selection for being able to handle it. And then there's another issue in relation to your question, John, which is, first of all, you know, some people say, well, not all shamans take hallucinogens. Well, true, and I've excited some people's ire by suggesting, but all real shamans do. And, you know, saying that somebody is a shaman, I mean, imagine if simply being able to rave and exhort on the subject of the four Gospels qualified you as a man of the Lord. Actually, you have to sort through dozens of so-called preachers to find somebody you would be willing to leave alone with your chickens. Well, similarly, you have to sort through a lot of people who claim to be shamans before you find somebody who really is one. I mean, if we tend to be naive, go to the Amazon with your heart on your sleeve seeking ayahuasca, and I guarantee, unless you go well connected, you'll drink a lot of swill before you get to somebody honest enough, responsible enough, conscientious enough to actually make it right and do it right. And in the case of shamanism, usually this is going on in cultures without literacy, without written languages, and so they don't hold conferences or publish proceedings or have the university matriculation examinations in shamanism. So on the surface, a shaman is anyone who claims to be a shaman or who cares to claim. But in terms of real shamanic ability, I think it only comes through either innate special abilities, which probably means innate high sensitivity to neurological to neurotransmitters, exotic neurotransmitters, or it comes through an exposure to hallucinogens. This is a big argument in anthropology. Mircea Eliade, who normally I am very deferent to, got this one completely wrong and decided on absolutely no evidence that what he called narcotic shamanism was decadent. Well, first of all, the use of the word narcotic in that context shows that he didn't know what he was talking about. Nobody uses narcotics to shamanize. You go to sleep if you take narcotics. So What he wanted to say was that he felt hallucinogenic shamanism was decadent, but what is the alternative? Reliance on ordeals, fasting, or pathological personalities, maybe epileptics or borderline schizophrenics or something like that. I think that these kinds of shamanisms that are not hallucinogenically based are derivative shamanisms that occur at a later stage of culture when the plant-based shamanism has been disrupted by some factor like migration or the disappearance of the plants involved or something like that. Yeah.
From what I understand, the Lakota Indians didn't use hallucinogenics. They accomplished all this through, the drum beat and the song and things like that. And to this day, if you talk to the Lakota about the use of hallucinogenics as far as their shamans go, they say it's not necessary. And yet in the Southwest, it's prominent.
Yeah, well,
right on.
I think acoustical driving can carry you a certain distance. There are substitutes for hallucinogens, but they're neither as effective nor as pleasant. I mean, ordeals are what many cultures get into.
Well, I was just thinking, along the lines of, someone like Crazy Horse who came out of Lakota who seemed to possess these, abilities and manifest them physically.
Well, there's also the exceptional personality. The exceptional personality breaks all the rules, see. But, something I wanted to say.
So would you say then, Terence, that there is a genetic proclivity, maybe in some individuals, if there is access to botanicals, and if there is no historical evidence of shamanism prior to that, for that individual to start engaging in explorations?
Yeah, I think so. Maria Sabina claimed that she was never initiated into shamanism. She claimed that as a girl herding the cattle, she ate the mushrooms because she was hungry, and that she was basically self-taught in shamanism in a society that actually had shamanic lineages and institutions. In Madagascar, there are these highly evolved ordeal poisons, and this is where you take a plant, you feel like you're dying, you beg to die, you want to die, and you don't die. You come back from it a better person, but it is only because you were slammed up against death itself. Ordeals work, but they're not very pleasant, and the idea of putting yourself through an ideal like that once a week or twice a month as part of your professional practice is pretty outrageous. The other thing that has to be said, and this is really important, and I think anthropologists have sold this one short, experiences are what we are least able to communicate to each other. We can describe machine parts, agricultural procedures, but anything in the realm of feeling, our languages are woefully impoverished, and I don't think that's specific to English. I think it haunts all human experience, that it's hard to communicate how we feel. Well, so then there's a vast spectrum of experiences that come from plants, and I dare say most of them unpleasant. Let's start out with eating Dieffenbachia or something. which causes your throat tissues to swell up and you feel like you're strangling. Or, Amanita muscaria is a very controversial shamanic plant because some people say it's garbage, and Gordon Wasson in his last book called it the supreme entheogen of all time. Well, clearly people are they talking about different things, or are they interpreting the same experience differently? And so there are, for example, people who are fond of peyote, like, if they haven't done their homework, like to imagine that they are taking this ancient hallucinogen that has informed the lives of the Sonoran and the Indians of that area for thousands and thousands of years. Well, this is, as far as anybody can tell, complete bunk. There is no record of peyote use older than 400 or 500 years. Most of it is post-ghost dance. When you go into the old Sonoran graves, the old archaeology of the Sonoran, the Tarahumara Indians, you find Socorus secundifolia beans, the little black and red beans that you see in Mexico strung into jewelry sold along the side of the roads. That's what those Indians took for thousands and thousands of years. We have a continuous record over about 4,000 years of these seeds being buried in graves with ritual instruments indicating that they were buried with shamans. You couldn't give it away today because it is such a horrible experience. It's essentially sublethal strychnine poisoning. It can kill you effortlessly. It's clear that at some point, fairly recently, somebody tried peyote and said, my God, this stuff we've been taking for thousands and thousands of years is just horrible compared to this. This is great. And immediately there was a transfer of loyalty. And Lord knows, eating fresh peyote is no gourmet undertaking. So the point there being, cultures tend to define experiences differently, and you can't tell what people are talking about until you really check in. Traveling around the world, you end up in certain cultures, and they say, "Oh, we're so happy to have you here. As our honored guest, we would like you to eat some of our national food." Let's say you're in Scotland, and so they say, well, you must eat some haggis because this is what we all eat. We all really love this. This is the best part of Scottish life. Boy, are you going to love this. Well, when it's finally served, your jaw drops in disbelief because it's ghastly unless you're Scotch. And well, but if you're Scotch, you dare not say so, you see, because a cultural myth has been built up around. I mean, do Italians knock red wine? Do the French denounce truffles? Certainly not.
How do you know the origin of Scotch?
True. Pâté de foie gras is always my example. So what you have to realize is that these things are culturally defined, and often what works for the Yanomamo or the Muinani or the Witoto won't work for you. Datura is a good example. Datura is a shamanic plant used by many people throughout the world. All of them, I think, pharmacologically deprived. Otherwise, they wouldn't put up with what you have to put up with to take that stuff, And my interest, and it was practical, was to find a hallucinogen that did what I wanted it to do and didn't do anything I didn't want it to do. And what I was interested in was, first of all, hallucinations, because Some people say I'm obsessed with it. Fine. My notion is that if you can see something that isn't there, that's very much more convincing than just funny thoughts, racing ideas, strange physical sensations. It's a powerful and boundary-dissolving confrontation when you confront what is not there. And so I find, and this is a heresy for sure, I'm not that fond of LSD. I think it's a very sloppy drug. I think, you feel terrible the next day. I always did. I had tight headaches, body aches. People always say, well, it was not clean, it had speed in it, it had strychnine in it. Maybe. But even the good stuff is not, and it wouldn't hallucinate for me the way I wanted it to. I could get hallucinations if I would smoke hash with it. But on its own, it was what I have described in other places as abrasively psychoanalytic, unpleasant, confrontational. And what I was interested in were hallucinations. So when I got to psilocybin, I remember after my first mushroom trip, I said, thank God we found this stuff. I'll never take LSD again. That wasn't quite true, but I'll bet I've taken it less than half a dozen times since my first psilocybin trip. So, and in terms of the chemistry of these things, my conclusion from all this fiddling is that it's the indole hallucinogens that are at the center of the mandala. They do what we want them to do with very little detrimental side effect. LSD is one of them. Ibogaine is one of them. Not one widely known. We got to save something for our old age, folks. Harmine and harmaline, the beta-carbolines, when complexed with DMT, and then psilocybin, and I think that's the basic list. Well, those these are really the keys which open the lock very easily, very cleanly, very dependably. And that's where I would put all of my attention. And, even in that domain, you have to be somewhat careful. My brother and I spent years tracking down a hallucinogen in the Amazon called ukuhe that was an orally active form of DMT, which remember I said that DMT is destroyed in the gut. So we were fascinated to try and find this ukuhe because we wanted to know how it was possible that it could work orally. And also the ethnographic accounts claimed that the people who used it spoke with little men. And we wanted to see these little men, to see if they were the same little men we were trying to. Well, we had 3 expeditions to the Amazon before we finally closed in on this stuff. And when we finally got it, with this tremendous sense of having attained the grail and having finally this was going to do it, this was going to be the one, then we took this stuff. And my God, it turned us every way but loose. Your heart feels like it's pounding its way out of the front of your chest. You vomit. You have tremoring of the limbs. On and on and on. So we go through this, live through it, wash off in the river and go looking for the shaman to lodge a complaint. And he says, yeah, well, it's hard to get used to. And so then when we get it back home to the lab and do the high-pressure gas chromatography and all the rest of it and see what's really there, you see that the genetic component of the varroa trees from which this resin is extracted it's a mess. It's too many tryptamines. DMT, DET, 5-monomethyltryptamine, 5-MAO DMT, and several other cardioactive tryptamines. It looked like they'd swept the floor of an endochemist's lab to put together the components of this plant. You don't want this. You don't, because it's like taking 10 drugs at once. You know, it's all running together. You can't tell whether you're Agnes or Angus. What you want is a DMT source where when you put it in the gas chromatograph, you get one spike, that's N-dimethyltryptamine, and all the rest is cellulose, a little DNA, and that's all, some minerals and salt. If you don't have a clean source, then, you know, it's contaminated. So even that legendary shamanic hallucinogen, when actually put to the use test, wasn't able to pass it.